Welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today we'll talk about how to represent problems or error conditions in HTTP APIs. As so many times, we'll say hello to Mike Amundsen. Hey Mike, how are you doing?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So what we want to do today is we'll take a close look at RFC 7807, which is a specification for representing problem details in HTTP APIs. But it's a simple spec, so we won't spend too much time with it. And then we'll spend some time discussing with you how you use that spec in your APIs.
Definitely.
Let's very briefly start by saying, why do we even have that? So why is there such a spec? How did you get started to use it? And why is it a good idea, generally speaking, to look at such a spec and maybe consider using it?
Yeah, so I was, I'm always trying to create APIs that are easy to use, maybe that can be used with a generic client or a client that, that I've built before, reusability. And I found myself building the same thing over and over, trying to create some error information in my API. I used to build errors into APIs, but that gets pretty tedious and it gets repetitive. So I was looking for a standardized way to do this, and that's how I came across 7807, the specification you helped write with Mark Nottingham.
And I think it's a really good example of this thing that we discussed a little while ago when we talked about standards, right? Saying that for certain things that you're doing repetitively, try to avoid doing them over and over again. Instead, use standards. It could be your own standards. It could be somebody else's standards, can be an RFC standard, right? But whatever you do, if you reuse those things and don't reinvent the wheel, then, and I think that's the nicest part about standards, it helps everybody, right? It helps you as an API designer because you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and it helps the API consumers because they don't have to understand how that concept is represented in that API for every API in a new way, because it's always represented in the same way.
Yep, and in fact, for me, both as producer and consumer, from the backside internally, I just have a little module that supports this problem types, media type, and I can plug it into the producer side so that if there's an error, produce this message, and I can plug it into the consumer side. If you see this media type, consume this message. So I wrote it once several years ago, and I just keep reusing it hundreds and hundreds of times.
Yep, that's nice on the provider side, right? And on the consumer side, you could also imagine that you have infrastructure in place that just generically looks at HTTP and harvests error messages and sees what kinds of errors do we typically see. So that could be another piece of tooling you could build around such a spec.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's probably a good idea to use it. So let's jump into that spec. It's a very simple one. It's a media type that's defined in JSON. So it's specifically for JSON APIs. And again, it's intended if you want to expose something that's more detailed than just an HTTP status code, then this is the spec for you. Details about problems that you want to report. Right. Let's briefly go through like those 5 simple members that are in there.
So I'm really curious as we go through these, how it is you decided on these 5 and like what role each one plays?
I think that was more Mark. Mark started the one.
Oh,
so Mark,
okay.
I jumped in a little later, so I think that's probably mostly Mark's doing. And I definitely want to give Mark more credit on that one than I would deserve.
Okay.
And they have a pretty simple role. So one is status. That's very simple. It's kind of just repeats the status code in the HTTP response, meaning that if you take those media type documents or objects as standalone thing and you want to store them and analyze them, you can kind of reflect the HTTP status into that, so you don't have to keep additional context. So that's just kind of a convenience function, so to speak. And then next up, there is a title, which can either be the generic HTTP title, so HTTP kind of recommends titles for the different status codes that it has, or you can, for example, you can internationalize it if you want to, use a language for specific consumers so that they can more easily read the titles. And then next up, there is a type. And that's where it kind of gets interesting, because this is where things get a little bit more specific, right? So that's in that case when you want to say, yes, this is a 404, but it has like an additional level of detail to it that is kind of almost like subtypes of the 404, right? And then you can use the type, which is, and we'll get back to that, right, which is a URI. So the type is identified by URI. Yes.
That's a good point.
So that's three, right? So we have status, title, and type.
Yep.
Then we also have something that's called detailed. So the detail just means it's it can be a little bit more of a detailed explanation of what happened, if in case you want to have that. So that's also intended for human consumers, so that they can maybe better understand what went wrong, in addition to just the relatively generic title. And then we also have an instance identifier. So if you want to provide information about the specific instance of what went wrong, then this instance, which also is a URI, like the type, allows you to identify that specific instance where the request failed or had a certain response. And then you can use that maybe later on for digging deeper or finding related information, whatever it is that you might want to do. And that's it. That's all there is.
Yep, and it's a pretty handy set. So I've used things in different kinds of ways, and from talking with you, I realized maybe I've not quite understood some of the details involved in each of these. I have some problems with the problems detail specification, right?
Maybe, yes. And you're definitely not the only one, right? So one of the things that I mentioned when talking about the type and the instance was that I said both are URIs. And I think that is the most common pattern that you see, where the spec is not really used as it is intended to be used, because people put in just general strings, assuming that I can put in any identifier in there, which is just not the case. And that is the biggest problem with problem details. And it's one that's big enough that by now the community has said we should probably fix that, maybe not necessarily fix the spec in the sense that we change it, but make it more explicit and talk more about how it's intended to be used, and maybe have a little bit more guidance in the spec, what are good patterns of using it, and talking about those URIs that are used for types and instances. That's one of the big things that we'll do.
Right. So we'll get to those in a minute, because I thought I was being very creative with a solution, but I think you pointed out maybe not so much. But
you definitely were creative.
We'll fix this. But the other thing is, since there's only 5 possible things in the spec, right? And not even all of them are required. There are times when I need to send additional information. So you have in this system sort of an extension pattern, right? In the spec.
Yes, there is an extension model. So the 5 things are well defined in the spec, and the extension model is as simple as you can possibly make it. So anything that is not one of those 5 is an extension. You can put in whatever you want to. There is no registry. There is no way to find out what something means when you don't know what it means. There is a potential for name clashes, because there is no name spacing and there is no registry. So it's the simplest extension model that you can probably have, but that is what it is. And I've seen in your examples how you've used it, that I think you actually made the most out of it. So that was definitely, I think, a pattern that you've used there that is really good.
No, I was going to say that. I mean, that was a bit of a challenge to figure out how to deal with that, and we can talk about that in a minute. But so first of all, I as a designer, I like the idea that an extension was contemplated, that it's possible to do this, right? And that clients, consumers should be prepared to see things they don't understand and ignore them, and so on and so forth. So I really like that in the beginning. But I was having a hard time. Some of my messages got really thick or really big and flat. So I ended up creating this kind of extension pattern where there's like one named extension, which often for me is my Mammon name, my brand name. And then it's a structure, like it's a hash table or whatever. Anything off of that, then I document inside my own application or service documentation or something, like what these various things mean. And that sort of keeps it all in one place and limits the name clashes, right? So I actually might have a name that someone else uses, but it's buried in my little structure, so it works out. So that's kind of the pattern that I've taken, and that's worked out pretty well so far.
Yes, and I think that is really a good pattern because there is no defined organization of these extensions, right? There's no proper namespacing and stuff. Being a little bit disciplined yourself actually is I think is a good idea. And what you're doing there, wrapping that in one thing and saying, this is my one thing, and then having the details in there, I think that helps a lot with just keeping things a little bit more organized, but minimizing the risk for name clashes and these kind of things. So I think that's
exactly. Yeah, and it allows me to go ahead and write documentation on whatever that object is. So that allows me to sort of like put it all in one spot, and often that is part of the service documentation, just like you have with other helpful, user documentation. So that's what I've done so far. But as we've mentioned, I've also been using the standard 5 properties, and when I showed them to you, you started to ding me. You started to like give me negative points or something. I started losing. So we need to go through this and see where I've gone terribly wrong.
Yeah, so I did not give you negative points because you have used URIs, right? So that's good. Yeah. So you did not do what you actually do see quite a bit out there, where people don't even use URIs. They just put in a string, and then technically speaking, that string would need to get resolved against the URI, which one you requested, right? And then your thing actually becomes a different thing, and nobody probably does that or is even aware of that.
So I will confess that until a few years ago, when I was writing the client's book, I was using simple strings in the type category. So I was actually red light. Well, because I do this, I just sort of serialize whatever information I have internally into the message. So it would simply say error, or it would say, it would name some like internal error. So I was doing that until it wasn't you, it was somebody else who was consuming these, said, these URIs are all messed up. And I said, huh? What?
These what?
What? So I really, honestly, it was all for type. This is in the type category. So I really didn't know what to do for type because I didn't have a model in my head, and I was lazy and I didn't read the specifications carefully. So I was creative. I put a URI.
Yes, you were creative. Yes, you get points for creativity. Definitely.
Right? I get points for creativity. The URI I put in there was the URI that points to the section in RFC 7807, which describes the object. That's good, right?
It's a good idea. So I think what you did in essence, right? You said, if I don't have anything to say about that specific type, then I'll just use some kind of magical URI or some it's like some convention URI that signals that, right? And saying this is not a specific type, this is just like the general whatever type, right? And that's a good idea to do because that's what people want to do. The only problem with that, right, is that the spec says if you want to do that, use the about blank URI, right? So it does have something in there where it says if you don't have to say anything specific about the type, then either just leave it out. That's actually the easiest thing to do. You don't have to put the type in there, right? The type number is optional. But if you still want to put something in there, then use about blank, which is equivalent to leaving it out. So then it's nice and well defined, right? And saying that if you find this in a problem details object, then it basically means, yeah, there's nothing beyond the standard HTTP semantics here.
Yeah. So the point was, first of all, I didn't know I could leave it out. Actually, I missed that point. And second, I had missed the point about colon blank, which is sort of the standard sort of null URI, right? It's like, I have nothing for you here. Yeah. So that would have been a lot simpler. I was creative, but it would have been a lot simpler just to do that, right? So I think that was a mistake. That was, it could be worse.
It could be worse.
Yeah. So the other thing along with for the instance, I often use the original requested URI or what was supposed to be the resolved URI. So I think that works really well. But sometimes, especially for consumer cases where somebody's like filling in a lot of inputs, I would actually have several cases of an error, of a problem, right? This field was required, this field doesn't validate, so on and so forth. So what I've done in the past is I've actually created an array of errors that I echo back to the consumer. Good?
No. so that one is definitely not within the spec. And but it is something that you're not the only one who has cases where this might be interesting, where this is something that they want to do. And I think this is a good moment in time to briefly talk about where the spec stands. So the spec has been around for 5 years now, and it actually has been used in quite a number of API guidelines. I think it's pretty well known by now. So it's used in quite a number of APIs. It also sees these kind of patterns of people not using it like it's intended to be used. So right now it's under revision. So the idea is to fix the spec, and again, in ways that it's not broken, but in ways that it's easier to understand and that it's clearer about how to use it and how to not use it. And this multiple errors kind of thing, that is one of the issues that is under discussion. So I'd like to invite everybody who's interested in contributing to the next version of the spec, go and look at the issue tracker. So there is it's discussed in the IETF working group that's working on building blocks for HTTP APIs. So you can just search for that working group. It's one of the documents of that working group, and there's a GitHub repo where the draft lives, and in that repo you'll find the issues. And that would be one of the open issues. So you could contribute there and say, hey, I'm doing this and I would like to continue doing it. What should I do? Right. And maybe there's something we could just write in the spec and say, okay, you can't just use arrays because that's just not how it's defined, and we can't change that.
Right.
But we could add a section saying, if you want to do this, here's a pattern of how to do it, and somehow keep it within the compatibility of the spec itself.
Now, here's another one that I've done before, and I think you kind of gave me bad marks for. So one of the controlled elements, sometimes if I'm trying to understand what happened internally on my service, I will actually have some version of a stack trace that I put inside that object. So an administrator, like if you're logged in as an administrator, you might be able to see sort of the steps. Now you just gave me a face. Like, what's that face? Like, why can't I do that?
That was my unhappy face. Yeah. That is also, it's actually also something that is already written in the spec, but maybe we can write that more clearly and see, what's in there. But the point is that it really should be about problems with the API and not problems with the implementation. So it's not meant
the interface
debugging tool. Yeah, the interface.
Yeah. Okay.
So whenever you start exposing implementation details, there's definitely security concerns around that, right? There's a lot of leakage that may happen. So if you want to do this, don't do this in problem details. Right? Figure out a way in your API how to do it. There are many other patterns that you could use, but don't do it in problem details, because that is really strictly about the API and not about, it's about the interface and not about the implementation.
Gotcha. Yep. That's a good point. All right. So if I call up the RFC 7807, there's actually a link at the top, right? That points me to the tracker, I think, the default version of the RFC. So if I wanted to get involved in the issues and all that kind of stuff.
No, I don't think that you get linked from the current RFC to the draft. So if you want to find the draft, the best way would be just Google for building blocks for HTTP APIs. That's the name of the IETF working group. You'll find that working group very easily. And then that working group right now, it only has like 3 or 4 documents. And one of those is 7807 biz. And then you will find it's probably 3 or 4 clicks. So it's really not that hard to find. But it's not findable from the RFC page.
Very good. All right. Well, I got to go because I got to explain why all those things that you say are wrong should be in the spec.
Okay. Yeah, you go and do that. You start pulling up our issue tracker.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, once again, thank you so much for joining, Mike. This was a lot of fun. I also hope that it was useful for all of you out there working on HTTP APIs. If you want to represent problem details, consider using RFC 7807. If you have any questions, please comment on this video, or even better, start participating in the working group. We need as much input as we can get. Okay. Thanks for joining, everybody. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and see you soon on this channel. Bye, everybody. Bye.